So welcome everyone to the to this version of the new Directions in Cooperative AI seminar series. For those who might not have been before, this is a regular seminar series in which we invite leading thinkers on cooperative AI to kind of offer their vision for research, and we're really trying to get people to kind of pitch the sorts of agendas that might make a kind of big impact according to the Cooperative AI Foundation's mission. Yeah, we kind of are interested in actually kind of supporting these agendas, thinking about the sorts of work that we ought to prioritize and gain kind of different perspectives from lots of different people and from lots of different areas. So if you think you have something that fits that description, then we really would encourage you to apply online to give a seminar. We're still looking for applicants, if you enjoyed this one, then you should subscribe to our mailing list, and all the talks are announced there, and all the details will be sent that way as well. Next little thing just to flag is that we also have an open call for proposals at the moment. It's the Foundation's first call for proposals for funding. And in particular, we're interested in work which improves our ability to evaluate the cooperation relevant features of AI systems. So this kind of could be theoretical, kind of conceptual work on how to define and measure a lot of these kind of like relevant concepts to cooperative AI, as well as kind of practical contributions such as benchmarks, data sets, all of that sort of thing too. So yes, if you again are interested in that, if you think you have something that you would like to submit, then applications are currently open. The deadline is rolling at the moment. We will close it probably, I imagine, towards the end of the summer, and all the information is on the website. So please do go and have a look at that as well if you're interested. Okay, so that's my stuff out of the way. So I'll just quickly introduce everyone. So today our speaker is Wolfram Barfuss, who is a research scientist at Tübingen, also a guest researcher at Princeton, as well as doing some kind of more kind of climate and earthy stuff. So at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and also as a member of the Earth and Resilience Initiative. And his research is broadly on the dynamics of collective learning, which I'm sure will be one of the themes that crops up in the talk today. We're also very, very fortunate to be joined by two excellent discussants. So we have Jessica Flack, who's a professor at the Santa Fe Institute and a director of the collective computation group there. And her research is broadly also on this kind of idea of collective computation and its role in the emergence of robust structure and functions in nature and society. And then last but very much not least, we have Tom Lenaerts, who's professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and a visiting scholar at Umeå Université in Sweden. And his research is on a bunch of things, but including AI, machine learning, optimization, collective intelligence, computational biology, and bioinformatics. So with that all said and done, I'm going to stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to present this proposal for an agenda on collective cooperative intelligence in this wonderful seminar series. So what is the challenge? The challenge is collective cooperation. That is the phenomenon when many individuals acting in the common interest, even if their incentives are not aligned in that way. And we see this phenomenon occurring in all kinds of domains: biology, ecology, and evolution. We see it in humans, and sometimes ask, what can we do to improve collective cooperation in the policy domain? And also in technology, when machines become increasingly autonomous, we have to ask, what makes machines cooperative? And so I've brought here three kind of umbrella questions to guide us through this agenda. And those are: first, what makes intelligent behavior cooperative? How can we overcome limitations to cooperation, especially when we're dealing with the global commons for a sustainable future? And how can artificial intelligence help and augment with this process? And so proposing here this agenda, which I called collective cooperative intelligence. And I'm essentially arguing for building bridges between a complex systems view and a multi-agent machine learning perspective. And in the remainder of the talk, I want to argue that building these bridges is important, is neglected, and is also tractable. So let's start off with the importance part. And here we recap some very familiar notions of social dilemmas from the classical game theoretic viewpoint, which I'm sure you all know, but nevertheless, it's good to keep us on track. So here you see the payoff matrix of the famous prisoner's dilemma, kind of a two-agent version of a public goods game. Each agent can cooperate and defect. And so from the perspective of agent 1, if agent 2 would cooperate, then agent 1 would be better off defecting because 3 is better than 1. However, if agent 2 would defect, then for agent 1, it would also be better to defect because 0 is better than -2. But since the game is identical from the perspective of agent 2, and both agents will ending up at defection, which is kind of the dominant strategy here. And now the dilemma of that situation is that, of course, both agents could gain more reward if they were cooperating. We call this also as cooperation here, the social optimal strategy. Now, this recognition that these kinds of situations can exist has for one led to the conclusion that here we need outside authorities that regulate those situations. And on the other hand, what's important to mention here, that when we repeat those interactions, then it's well known that cooperation can be stable. However, for the sake of this agenda, I want to highlight some challenges that this classical game theoretic approach comes with. And those are, for one, the assumption of having hyper-rational agents that have an infinite amount of compute available to assess their strategies and compute an expected value. And so they deal with arbitrarily complicated and complex strategies, which is not realistic for animals, humans, nor machines. Also, in more complicated games, when we have more than one equilibrium, which is the typical case, this theory cannot tell us anything which of those equilibria is selected. And last, it's a static theory, and arguably a dynamic theory would be more desirable, more complete. And therefore, one can view aspects of the artificial intelligence machine learning world see as kind of answers to these challenges. And here, I would say that the majority, the traditional focus, the focus angle of doing this kind of research focuses on single intelligent individuals, which are situated in complex environments, have to solve complex tasks. And so it's important to recognize that machines must learn to find common ground in order to help humanity solve the fundamental problem of cooperation. And therefore, as it has been argued, we as scientists need to reconceive artificial intelligence as a deeply social construct. And furthermore, the goal of this agenda, of this community, I would view as to then improve on multi-agent cooperation, making multi-agent systems cooperative. And here I just brought an example from a kind of a research paper from Google DeepMind, where the authors use deep multi-agent reinforcement learning when the standard methods of the classic non-cooperative game theory can no longer be used because of the environmental complexity. So essentially, here the agents in red have to learn to walk around and collect the resources in green, which regrow according to some rules that the agents have to figure out. And then you can set up the environment, set up the agents, start the training, and observe the training run. And we see here, after some initial bump, the agents learn to obtain a quite decent reward, indicating that they've learned to cooperate in this scenario. But of course, this field, this agenda, this type of research also comes with some challenges. And for one, I would view here the kind of limited understanding in terms also explainability, what exactly makes the agents cooperate and what traits lead to cooperation. And furthermore, it's also relatively resource intensive to perform these relatively large-scale training environments. And therefore, on the other side, one could view the field of complex system theories, how I call them here, and in particular, I'm thinking of evolutionary game theory and complex social networks, where the traditional approach is to explain the evolution of collective cooperation from deliberately simple individuals and simple interactions between those, with the goal to understand the emergence of cooperation. And so here, in this figure, we can see this process, which is from a famous review paper by Martin Nowak, when we start off with a population of cooperators, then through random mutations, one of those cooperators might become a defector. And as we saw in the prisoner's dilemma type of game, this defection is always better off regardless what the others do. So natural selection would select the defective strategy for, until eventually the whole population is full of defectors, while the average fitness is declining. So in well-mixed populations, natural selection actually decreases the fitness. But in this agenda, there have been found a great variety of mechanisms that lead eventually to cooperation, and probably the most famous ones are the direct, indirect, network reciprocity, kin and group selection, which all come with precise mathematical relationships that indicate when cooperation emerges under this evolutionary process. And so if you want to have a look into a more recent perspective on how evolutionary game theory can contribute to an understanding of the emergent behaviors in multi-agent systems, I recommend this very recent archive paper by Tian Han, and which I think is also a close collaborator of Tom. I believe in spirit very similar to what I'm proposing here. And now, for the sake of this agenda, let's also look at the challenges that this complex system theory brings with. And here I would view that for one, that the rationality of the individuals is extremely powerful. It's a very common set of assumptions that you put in, and then you can derive your equations. And therefore, it's not clear what to say with that approach about individual cognition, which I believe we should be able to incorporate in our theoretical framework. And furthermore, it focused so far more on the social environments, as you can see here, and less on dynamically changing physical environments. So with these two fields, AI machine learning and complex systems theories, with both their different approaches and also their different goals, it's important. I argue that it's important to bridge those communities, exactly because they are so different. They can complement each other perfectly. So I think the AI and machine learning community can lend ideas and give inspiration how to implement cognition into complex system theories, whereas those are able to provide generalizable insight to the cooperative potential of advanced AI systems. But also, because those communities are different, I think this is also a neglected space. So in general, I would propose to first translate what is known and common in the AI machine learning world into a mathematical efficient description, which the complex systems world can work with, likes to work with, use that to look and investigate the principles for collective cooperation, which can then be implemented back into cooperative AI systems. Now in the following, I want to kind of sketch and walk you through a space of largely unexplored territory that we could explore together. And to build up this space, we need a little bit of background, which I'm sure also most of you are familiar with. I called it here the multi-agent environment interface. I mean, essentially a collection of agents, each with a set of actions, and let's summarize that as the collective. On the other hand, we have the environment consisting of a set of states and some rules of their dynamics. Then at each time step, each agent chooses an action from their current policy, and then the joint action exerts on the environment. And as a result, the agent receives some reward and some observe the next state of the environment as well. And furthermore, we are going to need a famous learning algorithm based on this multi-agent environment interface called temporal difference reinforcement learning, which I view really as a general principle, general in terms of occurring both in animals and humans, but also being a prominent machine learning algorithm, which essentially links the resulting behavior of agents to the environment they are currently embedded in. So in essence, we can divide this temporal difference learning into two phases: the interaction phase of choosing actions and observing next states and rewards, where the agents essentially assess the current temporal difference or reward prediction error, which tells the agent then how to adapt in the second phase, how to change their policy in order to receive more reward over time. So now we are ready to look at this space and divide that into three dimensions from a complex systems point of view. And the first dimension is going to be the environment, where we ask what, when, and how do environmental traits promote cooperation. The second dimension is focusing on the individual, asking what, when, and how do individual traits promote cooperation. And the third dimension then looks at the collective, asking when and how does cooperation emerge in large collectives. Now in the following, I want to briefly go through each of those dimensions, starting with the environment, asking what, when, and how do environmental traits promote cooperation. So again, here, the disciplinary challenge is that the machine learning world tends to focus on large, changing, and uncertain environments, whereas the complex system world focuses more on the social environment, less on dynamical physical environments. So the question is how to bring the environments to a complex systems treatment to provide insights for cooperative AI. And I propose to first focus on the bare fact of heavily changing environments, then moving on to uncertain environments, and finally to more complex spatial environments. So what do I mean by changing environments here? Let's first acknowledge that often social dilemmas are actually embedded in a dynamically changing environment. A related concept might be the notion of sequential social dilemmas. And now this framework of the multi-agent environment interface just integrates the environment into a multi-agent learning, which is obvious if you come from the machine learning world, but still important if you don't. And so the question here to ask is, how can we mathematically capture the environmental embedding in a multi-agent learning in an efficient way to ask when and how do changing environments promote or also hinder collective cooperation? Furthermore, observations of the environmental states are often noisy and incomplete. So again, the question is, how can we capture this environmental uncertainty in a mathematically efficient way to ask when and how do uncertain environments promote or hinder collective cooperation? And last, social dilemmas are often also spatially embedded, which leads to an explosion of the state space. And here again, how can we capture this spatial embedding in a mathematical efficient way to ask when and how does spatial structure promote or hinder collective cooperation? The next dimension will focus on the individual, asking in general what, when, and how do individual traits promote cooperation. Here, the disciplinary challenge is that the machine learning world tends to focus on increasingly sophisticated individuals, whereas the complex systems world likes to focus on deliberately simple individuals, kind of the minimal set of assumptions you need for an emergent phenomenon. And so the question here is how to bring individual cognition to a complex systems treatment and provide insights for cooperative AI. And first of all, it's important here to recognize if we are in a multi-agent learning picture, we already have some form of individual cognition, I would argue. But I think we can go further by focusing on intrinsic representations, intrinsic world models, and intrinsic motivations. So about intrinsic motivations, which intrinsic representations, which is arguably something that agents have and also have different representations of how the world is. And I think we can also agree that learning efficient representations is critical for intelligent behavior. So the question again is how to capture this intrinsic representation learning in a mathematically efficient way, to ask when and how do intrinsic representations promote or hinder collective cooperation. Furthermore, agents may have also different models of how the world works, not how it is, how the world works. And learning and using intrinsic world models in an efficient way is also critical for intelligent behavior. So how can we capture this intrinsic world model use in a mathematical efficient way to ask when and how do intrinsic world models promote or hinder collective cooperation? And last, now, intrinsic motivations, which in general guide the learning without relying on externally supplied rewards for either improved exploration, control, or homeostasis. And when we're dealing with cooperation, then it's kind of obvious that the pro-social, other regarding preference type of intrinsic motivation promotes cooperation. But what about other common intrinsic motivation types? When and how do they promote or hinder collective cooperation, such as being curious, being cautious or risk taker, being controlling, or being predictive, having a low model predictive error? And last, let's look at the collective dimension. When and how does cooperation emerge in larger collectives? And here, I think the disciplinary challenge is that the machine learning world tends to focus on individual behavior in complex environments, whereas the complex systems world likes to focus on emergent collective behavior. So here, the challenge is a little bit different, how to bring the collective level to machine learning and provide insights for cooperative AI. And I suggest here to focus again on three aspects. Those are emergent sociality, emergent institutions, and complex collectives. So what do I mean by emergent sociality? Here, let's acknowledge that most biological agents are social. They learn through imitation or they bond with similar others, known as homophily. Now, many complex systems models model these traits in a direct way. For example, they have a homophily parameter where you can tune the amount of homophily agents have. But doing so leaves us unclear when those traits are likely to change, when they break down, and how they respond to changing environments. So I propose here to ask when and how do such social interactions emerge, depending on environmental and individual traits. The next point is about emergent institutions. What do I mean by that? Here, let's acknowledge that most complex systems are hierarchically structured and interlinked. And just to give a high-level example, think of a collection of neurons that is very decisive for the decision-making and learning of an animal or human or machine, which can form groups. And if those groups are composed of humans, then we call those households, firms, and states, which may form societies, and those can form even higher level abstract concepts such as norms and value systems. So I think despite aspects of this phenomenon is covered in existing research and research agendas, the question of when and how does a collective obtain a higher level agency seems quite fundamental to me. And if we make progress in this dimension, then we can also ask, how can micro agents, lower level agents, induce some higher level forms of cooperation? And the last point I want to make here is about complex collectives, asking when and how does cooperation emerge in those in large ones and also diverse, heterogeneous complex collectives. And I suggest here to move away a little bit from this agent environment picture that we saw earlier and just modeling and perceiving those multi-agent environment systems as a complex multi-layer network, where we have different kinds of information exchange between the agents. And those are for sure not exhaustive. They are just a proposal to be complemented. But I think for sure we would have something like an action observation layer, where the links indicate from which other agents you can observe the actions that they performed. A reward observation layer, where the links indicate from which other agents you can observe what they received as a reward, and also a reward layer, where the links indicate from which other agents' actions your reward actually depends. So I have proposed a few questions how we can fill up this space to be researched largely, I think, from a complex systems point of view, but in close collaboration between the two fields. Now, in the remainder of the talk, I want to highlight that this agenda is also doable and tractable. And for that, I took the freedom to highlight some results of my own previous work, not to say that others have not contributed to this agenda or to a similar agenda as well. And so where to locate what I'm going to present, it's not covering an exhaustive space. It will just focus on the fact of having changing environments and leaving the collective and individual dimension largely untouched. So what I propose, or what I did here, was to understand multi-agent learning, multi-agent reinforcement learning in changing environments as a dynamical system, which is kind of a well-known language from a complex systems point of view. An existing work on the learning dynamics focused less on this aspect of having changing environments. And so this method or this approach works as follows. You can start with any standard stochastic independent model-free reinforcement learning algorithm, such as Q-learning, exhaustive learning, actor-critic learning. And then we perform a mathematical procedure which essentially separates the timescales of the interaction part and the adaptation part to arrive at a set of deterministic and now environmentally aware reinforcement learning equations. And the structure of those equations is as follows. The new policy, xt+1, equals the old policy times the exponent of the policy average temporal difference error multiplied by the learning rate and properly normalized. We have proper probability distribution here on the left side again. And you can think of those equations similarly as the ideal gas model from physics, which makes a lot of abstractions, but is still a useful model as a kind of ideal model of the multi-agent reinforcement learning process, where the agents learn and behave as if they have a perfect intrinsic model of the current environment, including the current policy of the other agents. And by that, we gain an analytical understanding of the multi-agent reinforcement learning process which is deterministically reproducible, and by focusing on relatively simple environments, also computationally light and tractable. If we want scalability to large environments, we can use a connection to concrete process level algorithms, as here portrayed on the left side, the known and famous ones. And now we use this framework in order to refine this famous model of the commons, this public goods game, where we located and put that into a prosperous environmental state, where now the defective action is not only socially suboptimal, it also comes with the risk of collapsing the environment into a degraded state, where the agents have to suffer by a negative collapse impact M, which is a free parameter of the model, and only eventually recover back into the prosperous state. And because of the relative simplicity of this model, we are able to compute analytically the separatrices in the parameter space, here spanned and shown by the collapse impact M on the y-axis and the discount factor of the agents on the x-axis, which indicates how much they care for the future. And you can already see that we have three distinct regimes in this model. And so if the collapse impact M is not too severe, or the agents do not care too much, then we are in the famous tragedy of the commons regime, where in the corresponding learning picture, from all points in the policy space, the agents learn to defect. If the collapse impact becomes more severe, or the caring for the future higher, then we can cross this greed line where agents are no longer greedy to exploit others, and we enter the coordination regime. Now, both defection and mutual cooperation are equilibria, and from a learning perspective, we have a bistable regime where we see it depends on where the agent starts, whether they learn to defect or to cooperate. But in this model, we also obtained a third regime. If we cross the fear line and agents do no longer fear to be exploited by others, either because the collapse impact becomes more severe or they care more about the future, then we can enter what we called the comedy of the commons regime, where it does not matter what the others are doing. From all points in the policy space, they learn to mutually cooperate. And now, by having this direct connection between kind of the analytical solution and the learning picture, we can directly read from this graph that the simple parameter of caring for the future alone, without any form of social reciprocity, so the agents do not need to know that there are other agents playing in their environment, and turn the tragedy of the commons into a comedy, given that we have this dynamically changing environment and a sufficiently severe impact of collapse. And this is just an example of what I thought of as a generalizable insight that we can use to advance and to build more cooperative AI systems. We also kind of refined this approach to uncertain environments in recent work. And here I want to just highlight briefly that partial observability can induce a critical transition towards cooperation, as you can see here, where under a sufficiently high noise level, the mutually high rewarding cooperative equilibrium emerges, but only under the right conditions. But for now, let's conclude. I've argued that building bridges between complex systems and multi-agent machine learning is important because both communities with their different approaches and different goals can complement each other very well. It is neglected because the communities are different. And I've shown that it is also tractable to do so by using a learning dynamics framework and carefully constructing the right environments to extract those principles which might be improved as generalizable insights for more advanced cooperative AI systems. But for now, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
So Jessica, over to you whenever you're ready. I think you might be muted.
Got it. Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you, Lewis, for arranging this, and thanks, Wolf, for a fantastic talk. I'd like to start my remarks by noting a few points of Wolf's that I thought were really outstanding, and then finish up by noting a few directions that I think we need to bring to the fore in order to move forward. The first is Wolf's introduction of, the way I would call it, is introduction of game dynamics to machine learning and the study of artificial intelligence. And I see Wolf's talk actually mostly as making a compelling argument for explicitly introducing game dynamics to machine learning. And along these lines, I also appreciated Wolf's explicit recognition that we're dealing with multi-agent systems in which the agents have some autonomy and agency, might not be fully aligned in their interests, and perform imperfect information processing, and in particular regularity extraction from the environment that's noisy. I liked Wolf's notion of an intrinsic model. If you recall, in one of his slides, he stressed the need to take into account how the agents in the systems that we're studying are actually modeling the world. And this last point is also a central theme in my work on coarse graining and collective computation, and one that I feel is really underappreciated in the evolutionary and collective phenomena literatures. With respect to new directions, some of the key issues that I think are critical to get on the table include the underappreciated idea that conflicts of interest can, under some conditions, facilitate the discovery of good collective solutions. And this relates, the reason why this is the case is in part because information processing is imperfect. It's in part because components of biological systems have different windows on the world, and because there's a multi-optimization problem often in these systems. So we can return to that in discussion, but that's a very underappreciated point, that sometimes conflicts of interest are actually play an important role in finding adaptive solutions. And it's related to another point about noise, and that's that noise also can amplify the discovery of good solutions, or even transitions. Like, for example, there was a recent paper in the last year or two showing that noise in the study of collective behavior of fish, noise in the sort of fish copying behavior can induce quicker transitions to ordered states like schooling than you would expect. Okay, second, I'd like to see more explicit consideration of how macros derive from micro. This is kind of the physics perspective, which I felt was a little bit, missing. With respect to this talk, that would be something like formalizing how agent strategies combine to produce aggregate level outputs. And to do this well, we're going to need to develop a kind of strategic statistical mechanics, that's what my colleagues and I call it, in which we incorporate ideas from statistical mechanics and inference and cognition with ideas from theoretical computer science. To make that a little bit more concrete, starting point is to extract strategies from data, so to be very empirical about it, find the strategies that components are actually using, and then we build circuits that serve as hypotheses for how those strategies combine to produce a macroscopic output. And implicit here, again, is the point that we need to take the system's point of view. This is Wolf's point about modeling the intrinsic model that agents in these systems are using. And I think that's particularly critical when the system is doing a lot of information processing. It might not be so important when energy constraints dominate, but when information processing is really important, we have to take the system's point of view. So that intrinsic modeling issue. My third point is the value of multiple timescales, and in particular, what we call slow variables, or they're called slow variables in dynamical systems, for tuning. And the idea here is that slow variables, like coarse-grained variables, for example, by reducing uncertainty about the future, effectively provide a background or termination criterion agents can use to tune strategies. Now, hidden in this point is the idea that we need to consider meta-level incentives. So the slow variable might correspond to an environment that's not ideal from all of the agents in the system's perspective, but the uncertainty reduction that it confers is good for everyone in the system because it allows commitment to particular strategies. The point about timescales raises another neglected issue, and that is how much separation of timescales is optimal. So often in, for tractability, we assume there's a separation of timescales. We make the adiabatic assumption, and we essentially ignore the environment because it's thought to change so slowly. But with work on collective computation and niche construction, for example, we see that in fact, the environment and agent are often coupled. The agent is intervening on the environment and changing the selection pressures it's subject to. And that means that it's critical not only to model multiple timescales and understand how they arise in biological systems, but to consider how they're how much separation matters and whether biological systems can tune that degree of separation. Okay, final point I want to make is that Wolf noted the need to balance incorporation of agent complexity, incorporating agent complexity with tractability in the models that we build. And that's of course an excellent point. To this remark, I want to add an adjacent one. And that's that sort of a central observation we've made in our work on emergence is that almost all biological systems, there is incredible microscale complexity. And so we sort of know this. I hear people, you see models of the cell now and descriptions of the cell that are incredibly elaborate and complex with, they're packed with components, maybe even optimally packed. There's a lot of heterogeneity, there's incredible structure, but we as a community have not collectively sort of processed this yet. And so in our work, we've been trying to take that very seriously. And the collective behavior and complexity science communities that work on emergence, for example, still tend to emphasize the power of simple rules that scientists often impose from the point of view of parsimony, thinking the microscale is in fact simple, in order to study the emergence of patterns. But that's just wrong. And what I want to really push on this idea that what we need to understand is how biological systems are doing their own simplification, building their own effective theories for how the world works, and how those effective theories, right or wrong, influence the patterns that or in the collective outputs that result at the macro scale. So in other words, to study pattern formation and how different collective or macro scale outputs are produced, I want us to take more seriously the question of how biological systems do their own dimensionality reduction and simplification. So those are just some ideas I'd like to see sort of incorporated into our discussion. And I think they relate very much to the kinds of things that Wolf discussed, but maybe not explicitly. And so I'd like to see that discussion around these issues come to the fore.
Great. Okay, that was a lot, which is great. So maybe Wolf, do you want to kind of jump on any of that kind of things that you want to draw up particularly, and then we'll move to Tom and then return to quite a few of those points in the discussion afterwards, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. This was really a great comment, great food for thought that I'm sure I will have to process also later on. Let me just maybe echo some points that come to mind now, and one of those is your last point, that this micro scale complexity, which I also found kind of we need in these mathematical models, because I think we can only get so far if we always assume that the very simplicity, the very simple interactions, the very simple agents, and therefore I saw this individual dimension which incorporates this various aspects of what the microscale complexity can actually entail if we're thinking about a learning and multi-agent learning systems. Also, I think related to the issue of timescales is, for one, this perspective and this dimension of the environment, which kind of makes it explicit that we have a changing environment, and we are looking at the emergence of kind of these incentives regimes of tragedy, coordination, comedy, for example, what I've showed under certain conditions. And like one could view this type of approach as a way to understand, like, under what conditions the explicitly modeling an environmental timescale and environment leads to kind of an effective tragedy prisoners type, or when it's actually a coordination stack hunt game. And so this gives us a handle of relating the kind of implementing them, but at the same time knowing when we might not need them, or we want to leave them for a particular purpose. And at the same time, I think what's interesting about the timescales is that this approach of using a dynamical systems point of view, using deterministic dynamics for the learning, is in essence a separation of timescales between interaction and adaptation. And I thought a lot about, does this make sense? What does it mean? And so my take on it, my current take on it, that probably the best interpretation is not to understand that literally, but as the agents having a kind of perfect intrinsic model. And so loosening that assumption by thinking about having the agents having a wrong model or an incomplete model also brings us back to the issue of timescales here, and kind of making that that separation not as complete as it is in a lot of the learning dynamics work. And I think I leave it here with the remarks, and we can come back to these excellent points later in the discussion as a whole.
Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much, Wolf, for this very nice presentation. Also, Jessica, for her interesting questions so far. So I'm going to try to add my 5 cents to this discussion. So obviously, Wolf, you know that I'm very much in favor of what you're talking about. I mean, I've been going down the same road, not from a reinforcement learning perspective, but from an evolutionary game theory perspective. And so this makes what you propose very interesting. And that's why I would say, okay, you're right, it's important, it's tractable, but I would not say it's fully neglected, because I could go back in my brain to the 70s, where people already have been trying to think about similar kind of things. But it's completely true. It's not that it's neglected. It's just that people are not really paying attention to it. And I think it may be mostly the problem of that there is still a lot of difficulty in making one agent behaving cooperatively and making the right moves in a given environment, and actually people can rely on those systems and trust those systems to do what they're expecting to do, and not violating any norms or whatever is happening in society. So that the question of multi-agent and complex systems and collectives is like still for most people like far out, simply because of that. Not, of course, not in physics, of course, not in complex system society, but much more in the AI and classical AI vision. But what I would like to add, and I'm actually at most points agreeing what you say, but what I would like to add is one thing you did not mention in your discussion is humans. I mean, the entire cooperative AI agenda is about the fact that you have hybrid societies of humans and agents, not only agents, walking around in this kind of system. So it's very nice that you have simplified models of agents and that you understand what they're doing, but once you let them loose in the wild and they are interacting with their users, or they are acting on behalf of their users, like some of the work we are doing on delegation in AI, things become rather different. And then this would maybe be a door that you have to open, or a dimension you have to open in your schema. Say, okay, look, it's not an isolated system where just agents are playing a very simple game. They're going to be part of some kind of ecosystem where people have certain expectations and certain societal wishes and things like that. So I think that's a factor next to the factor that Jessica also mentioned that is maybe important here. And then one thing which actually was, I'm on sabbatical this year, and the first part of my sabbatical, I went for 2 months to Berkeley and had a chance of talking to people over there about my evolutionary game theory work, and they're very much reinforcement learning, single agent kind of approach to AI. And one of the things I told them, look, whatever is happening in social systems with agents, you will get cooperation if you have assortment. So I guess you know the term assortment from Novak and all his work, which actually means that as soon as you introduce a mechanism that starts to sort cooperative agents together and defective agents together, which I probably have a similar kind of name for things in physics, you actually promote cooperative behavior. So if you look at the 5 examples you gave, you can simply reduce them to a transformation of the game, right? You can simply say, by doing indirect reciprocity, doing direct reciprocity, it's simply transforming a Princeton dilemma game into a coordination, right? And you're doing exactly the same in the end of your talk. The end of your talk is show this nice 2-state system, but what you did is assortment, because by doing that, you allow cooperators to actually to meet each other more often than defectors. As a result, they have become more beneficial. So for me, in my career working on this kind of questions of learning and cooperation in social systems, it always comes back to that. It always comes back to that. And so this is maybe the major point in this entire cooperative AI discussion, is that what are the assortment mechanisms that we need to put into our AI systems when they're acting collectively? And this, by design, will lead to cooperation directions, but also, of course, defective direction, because I'm assuming you will not be able to exclude defective behavior fully. As far as I can tell in the things that I've studied, there's always like a margin for problems with defectors in this kind of systems. So for me, I mean, adding on top of the pile that Jessica put on the table of things that could be discussed, I think these 2 points is like, okay, we are talking about hybrid societies, that's one. And second, we are talking about assortment here. And I think these are 2 key fundamental things that you might want to take up into your collective cooperative agenda. And these are my 5 cents. Oh.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can absolutely agree with this last point of assortment, that also in my view, I think all those mechanisms essentially transform the game into a game where the incentives are such that cooperation can emerge. I mean, that's otherwise I can't make much sense of what's going on then. And you can do this either like more directly. I'm thinking here, for example, of having like other regarding preferences, for example, where it's immediately clear, okay, I care about you, so it doesn't feel so good if I exploit you, for example. Or it is more indirectly, more unintuitive. But what is intuitive or unintuitive, it depends largely on how much time you spend with the system. And so I agree that the main point is figuring out the assortment mechanisms, which is kind of a way of rephrasing what makes behavior intelligence. And to the point of humans, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to admit that originally I started to think about these issues with the goal to better model human social dynamics in models with changing environments. But this is, of course, a very hard thing to do, and there's a huge field, and of course, with models you always have to make simplifications. And so, what I like about this temporal difference learning is that it has some neuroscientific connection, some background. Not to say that humans use only temporal difference learning and that's it, but you can observe it also in very fundamental levels. And then at the same time, when you actually want to incorporate humans, and I'm absolutely agreeing that we should do is that, then I think what is best to do similar as you do the work with experiments to really test some assumptions and really like your experiments with the delegation, which makes a much more convincing case than just having a theoretical model there. But what is still nice, I would say, is that kind of the basic ingredients of actions and environmental dynamics, that they are sufficiently similar, whether we're thinking of kind of behavioral experiments or some mathematical models, that they kind of use the same language, and therefore they can also complement each other very well. And we are not locked in here by focusing on that, for example. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, great. So I'm sure we'll return to many of those things shortly. I also have one or two things I want to follow up on at some point anyway. But I think Andreas had a quick question in the chat, which I'll kind of move on to quickly. And then I noticed that Vince has a hand up right off the mark already. Wolf, are you happy to field your own questions, or if not, I can moderate and kind of do things. It's up to you.
Let's see. Please feel free to take on the moderation. Cool. I can look at the chat and answer those, but
no, I can handle that. Just
perfect.
No worries at all. So, Andreas, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Hi, Wolf. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. And now that you're here, I will send you the links that we talked about last time, so I won't forget. So the question was, hi, is the collapse probability dependent on what the agents play? And I already got a short answer from Tom in the private message, but that maybe it's nice for you to elaborate a bit on that.
So the kind of the collapse probability, the overall collapse probability depends on how many agents play the defective strategy. And it basically adds up to a fixed collapse probability that we set as a parameter. So we can tune basically how much probability would be with how much probability would the collapse occur if all cooperators would become defectors, and if no one would be a defector, then the collapse probability is 0.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Vince?
Thank you, Wolf, and also thanks Jessica and Tom for the very wide-ranging and interesting discussion. And I agree with a lot of the points here. Also, as Tom said, some of these points obviously have a history, as they always do. I'm looking mostly for kind of like, what are kind of the really specific directions in which we can make progress. Presumably, I don't see anybody writing a paper that addresses all these things at the same time tomorrow. So I kind of want to get a sense of where you think are kind of the most immediate directions for progress. And I also had some specific questions about, I think, the same game again. Maybe actually if you could bring up the slide again for the caring about the future game. Mm-hmm. You can still share, I hope. But my question there was, where was it? Good, this one, awesome. So it's an interesting game, or kind of a stochastic game. But it seemed to me like that there isn't anything particularly novel here in terms of how the evolutionary game theory of it proceeds, right? Like my impression is that like kind of your vanilla evolutionary game theory approach of like, or basically just about any learning in games approach would give you this kind of behavior on this game once you've defined it. Am I getting that right? Or is there something here about the specific way in which agents are learning that's getting you to this picture?
So at least from my perspective, the kind of novel thing here is to incorporate this temporal difference aspect of the environmental dynamics. So the agents have a discount factor, have a caring for the future, and therefore kind of incorporating the expected future value of their actions, which I haven't seen so much from an evolutionary game point of view. There's work by Christian Hilbe and others on the evolution of cooperation in stochastic games, which is very similar in mind. I mean, what this is motivated from is then basically the learning, individual learning aspect. And here you can say, okay, whether we use evolution or learning mathematically, it's all the same, fair enough. But nevertheless, like the motivation or the approach is still a different one. And I would argue what the learning picture gives you is it opens up this space of all cognitive traits. I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine that kind of these evolutionary agents, which essentially copying other successful ones, have like intrinsic world models or have intrinsic motivations about what to do. This is more difficult to imagine, and kind of the learning approach opens up this whole space in a more straightforward way. But I agree with you. You're right that here this is not done yet, and this is just kind of a baseline model to explore this agenda and this space.
That makes sense. I was just trying to figure out for the middle picture on this slide. I think the middle picture is just kind of basically as a picture of how the equilibria of this game work. In some sense, probably regardless of what learning algorithm you use or whether you even
exactly.
And then of course the dynamics on the right might be specific to what learning algorithm you use. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
For the center, exactly. It's just a computation based on the value functions, and those are independent, whether you think of reinforcement learning or just have social learning or whatever. It's just the expected future value that we use here to equilibrate. And you had also a second point.
So my broader question
immediate
was
progress.
Where do you think, because you've laid out such a big space of so many different things, which are all, I agree, great, but where, like, if you were going to focus on one of these things to write your next paper or not, where would you kind of focus, or what do you sort of see as the most obvious thing to jump in next, from maybe a technical perspective, like, we really want to come up with a new contribution that is going to help the agenda, the cooperative AI agenda. Do you have kind of any prioritization over this in your mind?
I mean, to be honest, this is something I would like to get out of this discussion as well. I saw kind of this space as the agenda space, and I also perceive kind of this seminar as the space where we present this whole space, and then we see what kind of hopefully some priorities emerge. In terms of next steps, it depends largely also on your goals, and we saw that there are different goals involved. What you can do very concretely is work out this aspect on the changing environments even further, like exploring exact conditions when uncertainty helps or does not help cooperation, looking into more spatial and complex environments. Those are all aspects where I have ideas how to move on there. But yeah, it's hard for me to kind of give a guided tour what we should do to prioritize and what we should do next.
Okay,
thank you.
I'll pass over to Andreas for the next question, but just before I do, I'll also flag that if anyone else in the call, so Jessica, Tom, or any of the participants, if you have thoughts on that question of Vince's about what are the kind of most important kind of parts of this kind of three-dimensional space that Wolf just described in the talk for kind of immediate progress and so on, would love to hear them. So feel free to raise your hand for those sorts of comments as well. But yeah, Andreas, if you want to, perfect.
Yeah, I have no direct comment on one of the three axes. I think they're all very important, so I'll leave it at that for now. But my question to you, Wolf, is like, okay, you've been talking about bridging this gap, and it's very important. I totally agree. But do you think we should start with, let's say, simple algorithms like tabular Q learning or maybe simple policy grading, then see how we can analyze this? Or do you think there's already also a need to go towards, more advanced algorithms like that use function approximation, maybe in some deep neural networks? Do you think there's like different agendas for that, or do you think that we can take them both on at the same time?
So with respect to function approximation, what this boils down to me is the question of intrinsic representations. And of course, the motivation from the machine learning point of view to use function approximation is to make the algorithm scalable. I think from the complex systems point of view, we are more interested to understand under what conditions exactly the assortment is as such that cooperation can emerge. And so if we want to take on this goal of understanding, then I would view and embrace the fact of having function approximations as intrinsic representations, how the agents represent their environment, and what this then makes to cooperation. So in short, this is the point in this space where the function approximation comes in.
So it's the next step in, like, let's say, your individual dimension that you would take, or that we can take. Okay, yeah, I see. Just a quick question. So this work on the slide here, this I guess is with tabular Q learning, or?
This is basically tabular Q learning. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I think Tom is next on the list.
Yes. Sorry, I had a question about the slide before this that you showed more technically with the equation. This one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the discussions I always have with people in reinforcement learning, me as being an evolutionary dynamics person, is that in the end we're both doing social learning, right? So in both cases observational learning, and in case of evolutionary dynamics you do imitation of whatever is good, and in reinforcement learning you simply update your behavior in function of your feedback from the environment, right? Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, because you're interested in coming up with general models, whether you could simply say, look, stop separating reinforcement learning from evolutionary game dynamics, because in the end, I will give you here a social learning equation which covers both of them at the same time, and which mimics multiple multi-agent environmental adaptation process. So is it reasonable to think in that way? Or do you think this stuff has to remain separated, where you need to separate the level of the individual learning and the level of the population dynamics, mm-hmm. or whether you can collapse all these things into one, because essentially they're doing the same thing, which is observational learning, or social learning? Because for me, it will be like a key research question, because it will advance, at least join these two approaches and advance techniques in significant ways, I think. So I would like to have your take on that. Or other people who have if other people in the room have comments on this, please feel free to jump in.
Could you elaborate a little bit on how the individual reinforcement learning process is a social learning process in your view?
It's observation. You observe, you take an action, you take a feedback, and you adapt your behavior in function of that. So you observe the effect of your actions, or you observe the effect of actions of other players and you use that to adapt your own behavior. Whereas in case of evolutionary game dynamics, you assume imitation. So you say, okay, I'm looking at a neighbor. Is he better than me? I will imitate his behavior, yes or no. So in both cases, social learning, right? So for me, this is actually all under the same umbrella. The only difference that I see is that the imitation process and the reinforcement learning process are, one is more simpler than the other, but essentially it comes down to the same story. So I'm just wondering, the equation you're showing here on the slide, at the xt plus 1, I'm assuming this is the behavior in the collection of agents, or is it behavior in an average agent, or what are you talking about here? This xt plus 1.
So this can actually, or is actually the behavior of an individual agent, and we could just have indices I over dx for multiple agents.
Okay. So this means you have, if you have an relation of n agents. Okay, this was confusing for me. I was assuming this equation was actually a mapping of the entire thing on the left. So you're saying no, it's only one. It's mapping for one agent.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to have a collection, you have to actually have multiple of these equations.
Yeah. So I think to be more precise, I should have put here an I for the index of the agent. So we model each agent with this kind of learning update. And so to me, the connection is like based on this Berger-Sarines paper from 1997, I think, where they show that the evolutionary game theory replicator dynamics is essentially also justifiable from a reinforcement learning point of view.
Yeah.
And the connection is that like a whole population of evolutionary agents maps onto a single reinforcement learning agent.
Okay, so it's like the work of my former colleague Carol Telsen.
Exactly.
Okay. No, because you use that type of collective learning dynamics, so I was a bit confused. So I wanted to make sure that I was correct, but I was wrong in my assumption. No. Okay. No, sorry. Then my question doesn't make any sense. Forget about it. Okay.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think it's a very important question. I have thought a lot about how to bring the social learning and the individual learning together. And of course, there are models that do that in a kind of straightforward way. You start the individual or you start the social learning. But how to do it in a kind of,
especially because you have this very simplified model for the business learning of an agent. I mean, it comes back to the question of Jessica also. Is this connection between the micro and the macro level? So this equation is describing still the micro level, whereas evolutionary game dynamics is describing the macro level. So you would like to have some way to meaningfully combine these two things into one formulation that you can at the same time express the effects of the micro level at the macro level somehow, right? And so that for me would be like, if based on Vincent's question, this would be like an important research angle that I think people have been looking at since the 70s, but never really solved. So, or maybe once in a while thinking about it, but not really tackling it. And I think here, because your ambition is this collective learning dynamics agenda, which I understood it wrongly, but this is really, for me, very clear principal problem, is to make that connection between those two things. And that actually is very important. But there are more people who have questions, so I'm going to shut up now. Sorry.
Thank you.
Cool. I think Clémence was next, and then Jessica is up after that.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the great talk. I had a couple questions. I think the first one has been answered, or at least partially answered, by your short conversation with Andres a bit earlier. But I mean, I was still wondering if, according to you, there is, because you talked about this individual dimension and the fact that with a dynamical system approach, you would be concerned about studying very simple agents and see how like collective behavior emerges from that, for instance, like from their interactions. And I mean, I was also wondering if there is, according to you, let's say an optimal level of complexity in the individual algorithms. So from like very simple to learning to more sophisticated agents with, I don't know, deep reinforcement learning and so on. Or neural networks to investigate those questions while maintaining the issues tractable, because you're also concerned with like tractability. Like if, in your opinion, there is an optimal level of complexity at the individual level in the algorithms, and if it's even worth it to investigate more complex algorithms or not. And I guess my second question was more conceptual, because you talked also, like with respect to this individual dimension, about intrinsic representations and intrinsic world model. And I'm not sure I really grasp the difference between those, because it seems to me that like a world model involves representations in a sense.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for those questions. So regarding the optimal level of complexity, I think it depends heavily on your goal, on your question, what you want to achieve with the model. And I just was reminded by this quote, I think it's from Einstein, who said something like, it should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And my take on it, this is kind of the art of setting up the model. It's I don't know, or I don't think there is a kind of algorithm that gives you the optimal level of complexity at the end. But the point I want to get across is that we should be able to connect the different levels of complexity. So we can use that in a learning dynamics fashion for studying simple systems, but we have some rough idea how they connect to the more complex algorithms, which we can use to scale up the approach. And having that connection is crucial to connect the different levels. And please remind me of the second question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it's just the difference between intrinsic representation.
Yeah. So with intrinsic representations, I absolutely agree that this might be hard to really get without the mathematics or how the formal framework. But intrinsic representations are essentially, in my view, a mapping from the environmental state to some possibly reduced set of representing those states from which the agent then it draws further actions, and of course you can hierarchically stack that if you want. Whereas and then with an intrinsic world model, I mean a kind of an intrinsic model of how the environment and the other agents behave and work, and you can use that to kind of simulate. You can think of agents dreaming their actions and imagining how it would play out, and use that to improve their learning, make it faster, and things like that. And so, although both are, and both can complement each other, they are not mutually exclusive. You can have either or both in combination. I hope this gives you a rough idea of what I meant.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a bit like the distinction between model-free and model-based reinforcement learning.
Yeah, exactly. That's for the model aspect. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Jessica, I think.
I want to back out a little bit and ask why the emphasis on cooperation. And this is another version of the micro-macro point. So in our work, we're very interested in different kinds of objectives that the systems might pursue, like optimizing for particular outcomes at the macro scale. So generating a social structure that is appropriate for a given environment, for example, or optimizing or satisficing for robustness and evolvability. That's very different than optimizing for an outcome, or even related to the robustness evolvability point, optimizing for stability in the micro-macro map so that you have some guarantee that certain microscopic configurations are going to produce particular macroscopic outputs or law-like phenomena. And so it seems to me that sometimes cooperation is important for these ends. And sometimes, as I sort of was making with the conflicts of interest point, it's can impede obtaining those ends. And similarly, one might think of cooperation more broadly as not being about aligning interests, but by generating a sort of configuration, the microscale configuration that produces some meta level output that's useful to all components, even if it's not ideal for all components in similar way. So just to sort of reiterate, my question is why the emphasis on cooperation, and why instead not an emphasis on obtaining particular outcomes at the macro scale, or optimizing for robustness and evolvability, or the stabilizing the micro-macro map? Why cooperation before those other things?
I think like the practical answer is that this kind of the cooperative agenda is set by the seminar series, the seminar title. But what you're suggesting is perhaps a future seminar on how these possible goals are related. Like, under what conditions does evolvability lead to cooperation? Or is it maybe a more tractable goal, which gives us cooperation as a byproduct? I think those are very interesting questions to be explored. And from my own work, I actually like this emphasis on sustainability, and how sustainability is related to cooperation. What does sustainability actually mean? And of course, you can view cooperation as a means to get to sustainability, but at the same time, you can also think about the other way around, that if you care about sustainability, then eventually cooperation will emerge, because otherwise you won't be as sustainable as others. I don't know.
Nice. So, and Jessica, were you about to reply? Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I mean, I just again encourage everyone to explore the role that diversity and conflicts of interest can play in generating the outcomes we desire, like sustainability. And so if one has a broader notion of cooperation that's meta level, where you have multiple scales, and cooperation at one scale might require or even allow for conflicts of interest at another, I think that could be very useful. I also think just sort of shifting to the sort of micro-macro perspective, which is, a little bit adjacent to the cooperation question, it opens one's eyes to new sets of questions that are valuable, that I think get neglected. And the sort of cooperation perspective has been around for a long time. And so there is some like value in, being broad-minded and a little bit creative and out of the box about this. So I guess those are my current thoughts.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to abuse my position as host to both answer and ask questions in response. So maybe I can just speak to really quickly before proceeding, kind of why the foundation cares about cooperation per se, as opposed to all of these other interesting things. And I think you're totally right. In fact, this is kind of one of the questions I was going to ask, because I wanted to kind of hear from you actually an example of kind of where conflicts of interest might be able to kind of gain us some better kind of solutions and so on. I mean, certainly I know from my own experience more in the kind of machine learning side of things, paradigms such as kind of adversarial training and things like that are really powerful kind of paradigms that we can kind of use to reach kind of better outcomes as kind of system designers who kind of can control the preferences or something in some sense of the agents underneath, in order to kind of produce this adversarial environment, which we can then use to kind of competitively train different agents to do what we want them to do, essentially. And this is absolutely a kind of one perspective. And it's totally valid for exploring those sorts of things, and hugely theoretically interesting as well. I think the emphasis on cooperation more comes because our perspective is one where we are kind of intrinsically interested in the motivation of the agents at hand, or of, if those agents were kind of delegates of other agents, the agents that they are kind of acting on behalf of. And so for our kind of purposes, I guess, it actually really matters if those agents or the people they act on behalf of achieve kind of high joint welfare. And so that's actually the kind of what we're driving towards in some sense. And then the kind of thing about artificial agents is, well, presumably they're going to be playing much more of an important role in societies and all kinds of systems in the future. So that's where the kind of thing on cooperation comes from. But also I'd be happy to, if you wanted to kind of push back on that again afterwards. I guess maybe, because I had a lot of questions, so maybe I'll just ask one, because we're kind of nearing the end of time. And it's a very kind of pragmatic question, I guess, which is, so you spoke about kind of building bridges, and that's the kind of like main thesis of the talk in some way, I guess, between these two areas. And I'm thinking kind of with my like Cooperative AI Foundation hat on, I'm trying to think about kind of where the biggest bottlenecks to actually building these bridges are. Is it because, for instance, like, you know, people are publishing these papers, people have been publishing papers on these sorts of areas for ages, you know, for a while, even if now we're kind of getting a renewed kind of interest in it, in the sort of work that you were talking about. But is it the problem that, I don't know, complex systems people aren't like reading what machine learning people are doing, or like vice versa? Or is it they're kind of talking past each other? Or is it the mathematical formalisms are kind of like actually just like a little bit incompatible? Is there, yeah, what's kind of, what are the kind of like actual bottlenecks here? And what are kind of practical things that people could do to resolve those bottlenecks? I mean, having these sorts of conversations is great, and kind of publicizing them and so on, but I think I want to, you know, we want to be able to do more ideally. So that's the kind of, that's the question, I suppose. Yeah.
So maybe I can start to share my thoughts, and then others can jump in, because I think others have great ideas here as well. So in my perspective, it might already start with kind of the publication culture, that we have the machine learning world and conferences, and the maybe complex systems world more in journal type of publication venues. And from my experience, those tracks work differently, and so this is already something that somehow I feel manifests the different scientific cultures in a way. And that is another thing that is related to it, is the kind of different goals. I feel that that in kind of from a machine learning perspective, you want something that scales, that is in a somewhat large environment, some emergent phenomena there, and this is kind of the thing that is selected for, and not so much like when you do the work, then I feel you might come up with kind of a more abstract, stylized principle, but not necessarily with the scalable implementation. And I made the experience that this is not too interesting from a machine learning point of view, whereas maybe the machine learning point of view is not too interesting from someone who wants to understand what precisely triggers the cooperation here, or you can say, well, this is that and that phenomenon, and why is it interesting to scale it up in this game or so. So it's really the different goals that make it difficult from my perspective. But at the same time, I believe that the different goals are actually have also the opportunity to complement, but we need to maybe first acknowledge that there are different goals, and then we can move past them.
Cool, thanks. I think Jessica also has a hand up. So Jessica, you want to jump in on that? I'll also say that I will actually have to run off after this to go and catch a train, but I'm more than happy for people to hang on the call afterwards, but we're about halfway past the hour, so if people did want to head off after Jessica's remark, or anyone else who wants to jump in, would be a sensible time. But I'll pass over to Jessica now. Yeah, so I think the main problem actually is we need more synthetic papers. So there's a vast number of papers being produced in machine learning. There's not a vast number of papers being produced in complexity science, but there's certainly a lot. There's collective phenomena too, which is a little bit the study, kind of diverse itself, dynamical systems, statistical mechanics, then in sort of instantiation and neuroscience and animal behavior. So there's a lot of being done, a lot of overlap, but different use of terms, and we just need more synthetic papers. And a place where one can publish such papers is a new journal where I'm chief editor, that's Collective Intelligence. And we are very much looking for those kinds of papers. We have in our first issue, a nice one on, that's a big sort of synthetic review on deep learning, collective intelligence, and a little bit of neuroscience. I think it's gonna be very useful. So synthetic papers, and collaborations to produce them. Cool. Tom, do you want to add some?
Yeah, I fully agree with Jessica, and I just want to add on top of that there might also be a cultural problem that I noticed as a reviewer of papers for AI and machine learning conferences, is that this year I regularly saw a remark popping up from co-reviewers saying, it's no longer reasonable to just work on simple games. If you cannot show that your theory works on 75 Atari games and something else, it's not worth publishing in an AI conference. So this, I think, is also a bottleneck on having this kind of collaborations between complex system scientists who really want to go to the nuts and bolts of what is going on and how things are triggered than making the latest algorithm for solving a game or I don't know what. So I think this is also blocking a bit the collaboration in that sense, which I think should be avoided.
Okay. I'm going to resist the urge to complain about the state of AI publishing and instead head off. But I'll just say before I go, thanks again so much to Wolf and Jessica and Tom and for everyone for their
Thank you, Louis, for the invitation. It was very nice.
And yeah, I look forward to hopefully seeing you all at the next seminar. Thanks.